The talk is Ask the Animals. And this is taken from Job chapter 12, verse 7, where he says, ask the beasts and they'll teach you, or the birds in the sky and they will tell you. And if you read the rest of the book of Job, it basically is explaining how God created birds and mammals to serve and please us, but also to teach us crucial spiritual lessons about ourselves, about God, and how we can come into a relationship with God. You know, in the 21st century, we're the most scientifically educated and advanced generation in all humanity. But the things I've noticed is that in many respects, we're more ignorant about science today than people were at the time of Job, because we've lost contact with these birds and mammals, and especially with the wild birds and mammals, and especially with those birds and mammals that have not been damaged by human abuse. And so I think that explains why we have this growing rise of atheism today. People are cut off from the lessons that God intends that we would learn from the birds and the beasts of the field. Now, if you were here last night, you'll recall that I talked about how God creates three different kinds of life. I mean, as a scientist, I attend origin of life research conferences, but all they focus on is the origin of the first bacteria. The Bible speaks about three separate origins of life. It does speak about the origin of life that's purely physical, like bacteria. But on Creation Day 5, it speaks about life that's not only physical, but also soulish. And the soulishness is not a physical component. And then, last of all, it speaks about the third origin of life, where God creates life forms that are spiritual. So we have physical life, life that's physical and soulish, and one species that's body, soul, and spirit. And this talk is going to focus on what the Bible refers to as the nephesh. That's a Hebrew word that means soulish animal. Now, when it speaks about the soulishness, it's different from the soulishness you see in the Greek New Testament. It's a different word, nephesh, and this is what its definition is. It's referring to animals that God endows with intelligence, will, and emotions. They have a mind that's capable of free will actions. They have a relational capacity, an ability to form relationships with members of their own species, a strong motivation to nurture, especially their young, and a capacity and a desire to serve and please a higher species, namely us human beings. They were designed to serve and please a higher species, just like we human beings were designed to serve and please a higher being. So that just gives you a hint of some of the lessons we can learn. As they were designed to form relationships with us, we were designed to form a relationship with a higher being. Now, Charles Darwin sharply disagreed with this. And in a book he wrote, Descent of Man, he said this, that the difference between human and non-human minds is simply one of degree and not of kind. Mainly just saying, well, we're just simply a little smarter than the animals. But our mind, our brain, is mainly just an extension. There's nothing distinct about the human brain or the human mind. And therefore, he predicted that chimpanzees would have minds that would be most similar to ours. You know, if you look at the bodies of chimpanzees, they're the most similar to our bodies of all the non-human animals. He said that's got to be true of the mind. And in a paper titled, Can Evolution Explain How Minds Work? These two biologists wrote the following. They said, like Darwin, biologists have tended to assume that species with shared ancestry will have similar cognitive abilities. And there they're referring to the Darwinian model of ancestry. You know, how creatures that look alike have to have a recent common ancestor. But as you read on into the research paper, they say this doesn't fit what we observe about the minds of non-human animals. They discovered that ravens far surpass chimpanzees in intellectual capability. For example, chimpanzees will use a tool to be able to break open hard nuts. But all it is they find a rock and they smash the nut with the rock. What you see ravens do ravens will take a tool and use that tool to construct a completely different tool and use that second tool to get a food treat. And they'll do that without any human training. Now, my own dad had a pet raven when he was young. And he had this big cage for his raven, and he would put a lock on it. But then he'd put these little metal shavings inside the cage, and he would watch the raven pick the lock. But what he noticed was the raven would only pick the lock when he was watching the raven. If nobody was watching, it just stayed in the cage. And so my father picked up on this, and what he would do is he would take one lock off and replace it with a more challenging lock. And the raven would hop back into the cage. It would willingly jump into the cage, wait for my dad to lock the cage, and then go busy picking the lock. And my dad had half a dozen locks. That raven could pick all the locks. But again, only did it when it was being observed. And the other thing my dad noticed, it only did it when he was watching. It was somebody else because the bird was bonded to him. And then my dad actually went to the exercise of building these three-dimensional wooden block toys and putting a food treat inside, kind of things we do with children. And he found out that the raven could always solve the puzzle. But again, only if he was watching. Now this is something that ravens can't do in the wild. They can use a tool to recover a second tool, sometimes even a third tool. But that kind of sophistication only happens when they're bonded to a human being. There's a lesson there for us. Likewise, and this is something we've seen across all these birds and mammals, when they have a strong emotional bond with a human being, their intellectual capability goes up. Likewise, that's true of us. If we're bonded to a higher being, our potential is released in a way. So that's one way these animals can teach and instruct us. Now, in another paper published just a few years ago, and what was interesting, what caught my attention, the title of the paper was Darwin's Mistake. It's like, I've never seen that in the scientific literature before. That was the main title. The subtitle was Explaining the Discontinuity Between Human and Non-Human Minds. And what they discovered, for example, is that we humans have an innate capacity for symbolic communication, but none of the non-human animals are capable of that. So, for example, no matter how much you train a non-human animal, they're not going to be able to read the first page of the first reading book we give to grade 1 students. They can't do that. And the experiment went on. They discovered, for example, that no non-human animal can figure out what any of these symbols mean. Even if you train them, they're not going to be able to figure out what a stop sign is and be able to react to a stop sign. But even children that are 18 months of age can figure out what these symbols mean and respond to those symbols. We have an innate capacity to do that. And they concluded their paper with this sentence. They said, this symbol relational discontinuity pervades nearly every domain of cognition. And this is one of the new scientific evidences for human exceptionalism. You know, until this paper was published, the pervasive view amongst the biology researchers was that there's nothing exceptional about human beings. Everything we do is manifested in non-human animals. We simply exceed them by degree. But this is the first paper that said, no, that's not true. We do things that non-human animals simply are incapable of doing, no matter how much they're trained. And it's this symbolic capability that allows us to think abstractly and philosophically, and it's something we now recognize as a manifestation of the spirit within us. And this is what enables us to communicate and ask questions about what is there beyond the universe, why am I here, is there a God? Non-human animals never engage in any kind of philosophy. Now, in addition to making a number, and this is just one of many examples, where scientists in the last 6 years have now acknowledged we human beings are exceptional. We have a consciousness like the non-human animals don't have. We have a philosophical bent that they don't have, and we have this symbolic capability. But at the same time, they've discovered that these birds and mammals are exceptional with respect to all of the life forms. Because that was another Darwinian presumption, that the birds and mammals were simply an extension of the insects and the fish and the amphibians. But we now realize that just like we're exceptional, they are exceptional. And they are exceptional in their ability to form emotional bonds and literally to sacrifice. Nefesh animals are those where the parents sacrifice to a very significant degree for their offspring. But something else is they notice, they'll also sacrifice in order to serve us human beings. Now, one example of this exceptionalism is studies that have been done on parrots and cockatoos. And you may be aware of this cockatoo. His name is Snowball. And all you got to do is put Snowball into a search engine, and up will pop dozens of video clips, just showing you what this particular cockatoo can do. But let me give you some background on Snowball. Snowball was bonded to a teenage girl, and then the girl went off to college and couldn't take the cockatoo with her. And so the parents basically gave the cockatoo to a bird sanctuary. But they said to the owners of the sanctuary, you got to take our daughter's collection of CDs because the cockatoo really likes the music on these CDs. And it was basically a collection of Backstreet Boys CDs. And they also explained that there's one particular CD that the bird really likes. And that was, I'm trying to think of the song. You'll probably remember it because I'm not a Backstreet Boy fan. So, but this just is a short clip of what Snowball does when he hears this particular song from the Backstreet Boys. Okay, that's Snowball. Parrots will also do this. And when they're bonded to a human being, when the favorite music of the human that they're bonded to is being played, they will do a dance where they put everything they physically can into the dance. And so what you see with cockatoos, they do this amazing high step routine. Now, parrots can't do the high step, but what they can do is do amazing things with their neck. And so if I were to show you a clip of a parrot, and I got several of them, I don't have time to show them to you, but they can turn their neck like this and like this very rapidly. They're literally putting everything they physically can into showing you how much they enjoy the music of the human they're bonded to. Now, they've also gone into the wild because parrots, for example, do a courtship song when they're mating. But what they discovered is that wild parrots have not been shown to dance to a beat in the wild, even to the songs of their courtship displays. They don't dance. They only dance when they're listening to the music of a human being to whom they're emotionally bonded. So even their mate, when that sings a song, they won't dance to that. This only happens when they're bonded to a human being. Now, people have concluded that this particular cockatoo really likes the Backstreet Boys. That's not what's going on. This cockatoo really liked that teenage girl and basically figured out what really got her excited and enjoyed and began to dance to that music. Now, when I read about all this, I realized I could have published this 40 years ago because I had a pet parrot when I was a teenager. His name was Pedro, and he loved to sit on my shoulder, and he quickly figured out I didn't like him spotting my shirts. And so I didn't have to train him. What he would do is he would tug on my earlobe And that would be a signal he needed to go. I'd put him on one of his perches, then he'd hop back on my shoulder. After that, I never had a spotted shirt. Everybody else in the family did, but not me, okay? And that was a time when I was really enjoying the music of Bach, especially the Brandenburg concertos. And my favorite was the third Brandenburg concerto. And Pedro did the same thing as a cockatoo. Whenever that piece of music was played, he went all out dancing to the music of the Brandenburg concerto. Now, for some reason, he wasn't too excited about the females in our family. I had 2 sisters, and my sisters were into a particular brand of rock music, and whenever they played their rock music, he would go into a loud, screeching tantrum until they turned it off. Now, my mother's comment was, "Hugh, your bird is a music snob. He only likes classical music, he hates rock music." That's not what was going on. The bird was bonded to me, he was not bonded to my sisters. Really didn't like my sisters, and so he let them know, by the way, how he responded to their favorite music, but he also let me know how he responded to my favorite music. And it was an amazing bird because he would hop on my shoulder after I shaved, and then he would inspect my face to see if there was a whisker I missed. And if I did, he would clip it off. So, and like many parrots, he enjoyed cleaning my teeth after I had a meal. Literally go right inside my mouth and take care of everything. So, but I'll tell you the thing that really endeared him to my parents is that I didn't meet my grandfather on my mother's side until I was 13. He came to visit us, and he really enjoyed playing bridge. I didn't know how to play bridge, but he taught me. And so the time he was visiting us, he and I would be partnered against my parents. But the bird would sit on my shoulder, and every time I won a hand of bridge, he would do a victory dance on my shoulder and then sing this song. And my parents' comment was this: "It's bad enough to lose to our son at bridge, but his bird gloats." So, but again, this is a demonstration that these birds outperform what they'll normally do in the wild when they're bonded to a human being. And the stronger the emotional bond, the more evident their superior performance is manifested. Well, there's a lesson there for us. The more strongly we're bonded to our Creator, the greater our capacities and our potential is released in terms of our capacity to serve God and to serve one another. Now, as we move on into the book of Job, it shows how certain soulish animals were crucial for launching and maintaining human civilization. What you see in Job 38 and 39 is God basically rebuking Job's friends by saying, "You think you made all these accomplishments by yourself? You would have gotten nowhere if I hadn't created these animals first." Those of you who were with us last night, I made mention how just before God creates human beings, he describes how he created 3 separate categories of land mammals, the ones that are most critical for launching civilization. That was actually a summary of what we see in more detail in the book of Job. But in the book of Job, it gives you a list of the 10 most critical animals that God created and how we needed every one of those 10 to launch and sustain our civilization. So we take credit for this amazing city we live in, with the freeways, the skyscrapers, the automobiles, the trains. We need to appreciate we would have had none of that if it wasn't for God creating donkeys and horses and cows and goats and all the other animals we see mentioned in the book of Job. So as we jump into Job 38 and 39, it makes mention of these 10 animals: the lion, the raven, the goat, the deer, the donkey, the ox or the cow, the ostrich, the horse, the hawk, and the eagle. And in my book, Hidden Treasures in the Book of Job, I describe why each one of these 10 on the list was so critical for launching human civilization. And notice it purposely gives us a mix of mammals and birds and a mix of herbivores and carnivores, making clear we needed that full spectrum of these soulish animals in order to be able to successfully launch civilization. Each one was created with a unique soulishness to serve or please humans in a distinct way. If I can take you back to Genesis 2, it talks about how God told Adam, I want you to examine each of these nephesh animals and give them an appropriate name. What God was doing with Adam is saying, I designed each one in a very different way to serve and please you. I want you to find out the distinct way they serve and please you and give them an appropriate name. I was mentioning last night how we know that the seventh creation day must be a significant period of time because there's many passages that tell us we're still in God's seventh day. Well, likewise, the sixth day must be a long time period because it takes more than a few seconds to examine each of these animals and give them an appropriate name of what God designed to serve and please Him. And each one fulfills a role in launching and sustaining human civilization. We still need these animals today. They helped us launch civilization, but they're also crucial for sustaining civilization. And one of the things that was really fun for me to do in Hidden Treasures in the Book of Job is describe how God designed the goat, for example, to serve our needs at the beginning of human civilization, and how it's fulfilling a completely different role today in the 21st century. And how goats are an animal that will eat everything you ask it to eat. So for example, where I live in Southern California, we have a problem with forest fires. And we make these forest breaks where we basically carve a big channel down a mountain in order to stop the fire from jumping across. We used to do that with bulldozers, but bulldozers leave vegetation behind. Now we use goats, because goats will eat everything. You can actually train the goat to eat vegetation in a particular swath up a mountain. And of course, if it's a high mountain that's got near vertical slopes, that's not a problem for a goat. It's a problem for a bulldozer, but it's not a problem for a goat. And there's actually other ways that goats are fulfilling a role that we never even thought of thousands of years ago, but are crucial for modern civilization. And each of the 10 that are mentioned challenges the evolutionary paradigm in a particular way. There are easy ways to challenge this idea that natural process is responsible for the whole history of life. And I'm just going to give you one example. If you read the book, I go through the others as well. But 2 of the animals that are mentioned in that list of 10 are the donkey and the horse. Now, evolutionists will tell you that the donkey and the horse are strong evidence that Darwinism is correct, because after all, look how similar they are to one another, their physical appearance. And you can actually take a horse and a donkey and you can mate them and get a mule. Now, the mule won't reproduce after its own kind, but they basically make that as an argument that they must have a recent common ancestor. Here's the problem. They're drawing that conclusion by only looking at the physical features of the donkey and the horse. They're not looking at the soulish features, and they're particularly not looking at how the donkey is designed to serve us human beings in a radically different way from the horse. So what we notice about the donkey, and actually says this in Job 39, there's a whole paragraph on the donkey, and basically says, if you own a donkey and you lose it, and it winds up wandering off in the wild, don't worry about your donkey. It can move from being domesticated to being feral seamlessly. And that's true of donkeys. If for some reason they get loose and they get separated from their human owner, they're very easily adapted to living in the wild again. But you also see in Job 39, it says, if your donkey's been living in the wild for 3 or 4 months and you meet your donkey, it'll bond back to you. A horse won't do that. If a horse goes feral, it will probably die. For some reason, the horse is able to survive going from domestication to living in the wild. It will not rebond with you, but a donkey will. In fact, a donkey can do that repeatedly, so you don't really have to worry about your donkey. The other thing it says about donkeys is that they're highly motivated to keep you away from danger, which is why we use donkeys to take people down the Grand Canyon. They're very sure-footed, and they're going to do everything they can to make sure you don't fall down that canyon. And if there's a snake in front, they're going to back up. They keep you away from danger, and they're very good at that, which is why we humans have never used donkeys to ride into battle. As soon as a donkey sees the arrows coming its way, it heads in the opposite direction. Now, that's contrasted with a horse. The horse is different. The horse is not motivated to keep you away from danger. In fact, what it says in Job 39, the horse loves danger. It loves risk and can't wait to take you into battle. It gets excited when it hears the battle horn and wants to charge you off into battle. However, once it takes you into battle, it will do everything it can to protect you. And so horses, in fact, my grandfather, he was a cavalryman in the Boer War and the World War I, and he had several horses. And he said several times the horse sacrificed its life to save his life. Horses will do that, but they'll take you into the riskiest of circumstances, but they'll do everything they can to sacrifice themselves to keep you safe from harm. And the horse is the ideal transportation animal. Can you think of where we would have been in terms of civilization without horses? The problem with donkeys is your feet drags on the ground. And the problem with camels, you're so high up in the air that if you fall off that camel, you're going to do yourself serious injury. The horse is just the right size, just the right weight. It's perfect as a human transportation animal. It can take your gear, etc. And so that was the transportation system until just 150 years ago. And also notice horses come in a wide range of different sizes that we can use for different transportation capabilities. Now, the book of Job begins with this statement about the animals. Ask the beasts and they'll teach you, or the birds of the air and they will tell you. And what I've been noticing is at the beginning of the 20th century, the number of human beings in the world that would identify themselves as agnostics or atheists was way less than 1%. You know what the figure is today? It's about 15%. And it's rising quite radically. However, the rise of atheism and agnosticism is directly proportional to the rise of urbanization. Today, 60% of the world's population lives in large cities. And every atheist that I've publicly debated has been an urbanite. And I've been to Africa 3 times, into the rural parts of Africa. I've yet to meet an atheist in any of my visits to rural Africa. Now, I do see them in cities like Johannesburg, but not in rural Africa. And I've noticed the same thing here in America. When you get into the rural parts of the country where people have contact with these birds and animals, people believe in God. They may not believe in Jesus Christ, but they believe in God. And so, yeah, we are seeing this rise of atheism, but it's not because we're getting better educated in science. It's because we're getting more and more cut off from contact with the birds and mammals. And I'll just give you a hint about the second service. The heavens declare the glory of God. This just came out a few months ago, 2 months ago in the journal Science. For the first time in human history, less than half the world's population has seen the Milky Way. I mean, if you live in a big city, the lights are just too bright for you to see the Milky Way. Well, if you're not able to see the Milky Way, the heavens aren't declaring what they were declaring thousands of years ago. And hey, I've been in Shanghai. Shanghai, on a clear night, you can't see a single star. The heavens are declaring nothing. Now, in fact, we had some Chinese students visiting, and they looked up at the sky in Los Angeles, and they said, "What's that object there?" And we said, "That's the moon." And we said, "You mean you've never seen the moon?" He said, "Yeah, we've seen the moon, but only when it's directly overhead. Once you get down a little bit, the air pollution is so intense they can't even see the moon." So when it says the heavens declare the glory of God, you've got to get outside the city before you can see it, just like it is with these animals. So it's in urban rather than rural areas that atheism thrives. Now, I want to review for you here some of the lessons we can learn from these soulish animals, spiritual lessons. One we've already reviewed, they were created to serve and please and bond to a higher being. A lot of what I've put in my book is making the point that these are animals that will emotionally bond to members of their own species, but they also really like to bond to human beings. And they've done experiments about, taking a dog and a cat. Dogs and cats will bond to one another, but only when they're both bonded to a human being. They won't bond to one another if there isn't a human connection. And we've had dogs and cats in our home. It takes time for that dog and that cat to bond to one another. And it only happens if they have a strong bond with a human being. Both of them do. Created to serve and please a higher being, and likewise we were created to serve and please a higher being. And their full potential is reached only when bonded to a higher being. And likewise our full potential is only reached when we're bonded to a higher being. Now, some obvious pushback from this is, they were designed to approach us, but often they run away from us. Isn't that true when you go out and see wild animals? As soon as they see you, they run away from you? That's because they've been conditioned by human abuse. Because of human abuse, when they see us, they run away from us. But one thing I did when I was in my 20s, I took a vacation purposely all by myself and went into a part of British Columbia where the rangers told me no human being has been there in over 50 years. There was no roads, there was no trails, I had to bushwhack my way in. But I wanted to do an experiment. I set up my pup tent and just watched what would happen to the birds and mammals in the vicinity. First thing I noticed is they kind of surrounded my pup tent by about a 30-yard distance, and they were just watching. When I woke up in the morning, they were inside the tent. Showing you that animals, birds and mammals that have not suffered abuse by human beings, have a strong desire to reach out to us and make contact with us. And I was telling your pastors yesterday over lunch how my cousin in British Columbia, he was out in the Georgia Strait in a one-man rowboat, and suddenly this 50-foot gray whale came right up beside his boat, and he thought he was going to get capsized. But he noticed the whale very gently moved herself really close to his boat and got to the point where it was touching the boat. Then he reached out and started stroking the whale, and the whale just sat there as he was stroking the whale. Then suddenly the whale died and was gone. 5 minutes later, that whale came back with his calf and pushed the calf up right by the boat so the calf could also be stroked by my cousin. Totally wild animals. But also explains why we almost wiped out the whales with the whaling industry. They're drawn to us human beings. And so instead of running away from us and not getting killed, they would run towards the whaling boats and they would get killed. We almost wiped them out. Likewise with the passenger pigeons. They're now extinct. But the passenger pigeons were especially motivated to come to human beings. And so hunters were wiping them out, and the rest of them would just flock right towards the hunters. That's how we wiped them all out. Human abuse can do that. But it shows you these animals were designed by God to come to us. Likewise, we were designed by our Creator to come to a higher being. As they were designed to come to a higher species, we were designed to come to a higher being. But what gets in the way? Our sin. Just like sin and human abuse causes these animals to run away from us instead of towards us, it's our sin that causes us to run away from God instead of towards Him. Or what's more common, to simply pretend He doesn't exist. And so we need to appreciate that lesson. And this is something you see extensively in the book of Job, that our relationships can be damaged by sin. And if we examine how that works with the birds and mammals, it tells us, hey, that must be happening within us with respect to God. You can read a lot more about this in Hidden Treasures in the book of Job. And people were asking me, because we did a Q&A session last night, and a lot of people had a lot of questions. Every one of our scientists that reasons to believe maintains a Facebook and a Twitter page. And we don't use Facebook and Twitter to tell you about our personal lives. It's basically there to alert you about the latest scientific discoveries that give us more proof for the Christian faith, but we also answer your questions. So if you don't get a chance to get your question asked this weekend, you can take advantage. And hey, don't worry about memorizing that stuff. All you need to do is put in Hugh Ross Facebook and it'll pop right up and you can ask your questions. Same thing with Twitter. But let me close with this. The book of Job ends with 5 chapters on these soulish animals. But as it moves into chapters 39 and 40, it says, look at the behemoth and the leviathan, the 2 most difficult to tame nephesh creatures. And basically it's making the point that some animals like the goat are very easy to tame. Other animals like the lion are difficult to tame. And the same thing's true of us human beings. Some of us are easy to tame, some of us are difficult to tame. And God makes the point that we human beings have been able to tame all of the nephesh animals, even the most difficult of the nephesh animals, and names 2 as the most challenging to tame of all. And those 2 rank as the most difficult to this very day. One of them being the behemoth, which is the hippopotamus, the second one being the leviathan, which is the Nile crocodile, or what would be like our alligator here. And I've been to Florida to one of these alligator parks. I got to see a tame alligator. But what the trainer told me was I was handling that alligator from the time it came out of its egg. And I would handle that alligator for at least an hour a day. And I dare not miss a day. You miss a day, the taming will go away. And it was only able to emotionally bond to that one trainer, nobody else. By far the most challenging animal to tame. The hippos are almost as difficult to tame. You can only tame them if you raise them from the time that they're born. It happens when the mother dies in childbirth and a human takes over the raising of the baby hippo. Then it will bond to you, but otherwise that won't happen. And basically talks about how dangerous it is, these animals. But the book of Job ends by saying, you've been able to tame all these nephesh animals, even the crocodile and even the hippopotamus. But there's one form of life you're not able to tame. You're not able to bring humility to a proud human heart. As it takes a higher being to tame the hippopotamus and the crocodile, it takes a higher being to tame a human being. And the book of Job ends where God says, Job came to me for the humility he needed. The rest of you did not. So I'm going to ask my servant Job to pray for you that you'll learn this lesson from the crocodile, this lesson from the hippopotamus, and humble yourself before me and receive what you need in order to come into a relationship with me. Thank you.